Okay, so hopefully you're all here. I can't actually see you because all I can see are my own slides, but I'm hoping that you can see my slides as well. This is Jeff Mao on the other end of the phone here. So I wanted to welcome you today to the Future Ready Schools Leadership Summit. And thanks again to all the various sponsors who are helping to make this event happen, both Portical and Learning Revolution leading the way here, and obviously the Future Ready Schools movement. And we've got lots of other folks helping out, making this a reality so that we can share all of this great information with you. A bunch of other groups, including my own organization, Common Sense Education, and lots of other groups that I've done a lot of work with. So a really strong group of folks here. And what we wanted to do today was talk a little bit about curricular decisions in a digital age. So I'll start off with a quick introduction to myself. My name is Jeff Mao. So for those of you who I have not met over the years or not seen at some conference somewhere, I'm a senior director at Common Sense Education, which is also known well as Common Sense Media, and we're just simply the education team at Common Sense Media. And I've been there since the fall of this past school year that just ended, or for many of you, it is ending right now. Previous to that, I spent 10 years at the Maine Department of Education as a professional bureaucrat. I was the Education Technology Director for the state of Maine and oversaw our statewide one-to-one program, the Maine Learning Technology Initiative, as well as the Maine School and Library Network, which is our statewide broadband network, our programs for online AP courses. And before that, was a district IT director and began my education career as a classroom teacher and a coach at two different schools, one in New Hampshire, one in New York. Spent time there, and in fact was very fortunate that at my very first teaching position at Brewster Academy, this was in the early 90s, worked with that school as they were going through a transition in 1993 to a proficiency-based curriculum and a one-to-one laptop program, which at the time seemed perfectly normal to me because I was a young teacher and thought that everything that I was seeing was normal. And when in fact I learned later it wasn't quite so normal back then. And so I've had a lot of experiences working in both public and private schools, boarding schools, day schools, and state government as well. And so obviously this is all focused in and around the Future Ready Schools movement. If you haven't really had a chance to review what's going on with Future Ready Schools, I'd encourage you to take a look at futurereadyschools.org. If you're a superintendent, I'd encourage you to look at the pledge and consider signing the pledge. If you're not a superintendent, I would encourage you to forward this information on to your superintendent, have them take a look at it. So far we have, I think it's close to 15 million kids represented by almost 2,000 superintendents across the country. So that's almost 30% of all students in the United States. Represented in districts by superintendents who have signed that pledge to really try and move things forward for their schools. And the 7 major tenets of that pledge are right here on the screen. Today we'll be really talking mostly about number 5, providing access to quality digital content. Just returned this morning, in fact, after having some flights canceled last night, returning from Pittsburgh after the 12th of 13 of the Future Ready Summits. We've got one more to go in Orange County, California in August. And so I've had the good fortune of making the entire tour and being at each of the summits, helping to lead the events and run one of the breakout workshops. And today's presentation will just be kind of a microcosm of some of that work. We obviously don't have time to cover a two-day workshop that includes 6 breakout sessions in a half an hour here. But what I did want to talk about today was really thinking about curriculum and technology and how the two intersect. And most importantly, really recognizing that as we go into this, so often we have people who get very fixated, and you know, you even see it in the naming conventions. For example, you see one-to-one learning, and you know, the one-to-one is, you know, one student, one device, and then learning is the last word in the phrase, right? But really that we want to make sure that learning is the front end of this, and that from that learning perspective and from the goals that we have for our students, that leads us to think about, in kind of a backwards design model, okay, so how am I going to design instruction to support those kids? And how are we going to help all those kids try and attain all of those various challenges? From that, you can then back your way into what kind of content can support this work and what kind of devices will actually run that content in those apps in the software, right? And then from there, it leads to everything else, like, okay, what does our professional learning program look like for our faculty, for our tech coordinators, for our leadership? What kind of broadband networks do I need? What kind of budget do I need? You know, all of those policies, procedures, all of that stuff is really the aftermath of starting with learning, leading to instructional design, which then leads you to your content and your devices, and then everything else from there. Many of the programs we've seen across the country that have kind of sprouted up and really struggled, oftentimes it was based on good intentions, but sometimes just a backwards planning, in a sense that they began with a device. Maybe the iPad was new and they said, wow, that's really cool, let's go buy some of those, and then tried to figure out what do we do with these. So we really want to make sure we start with the learning. It's that same question that you always get asked if you go find your friend who is the geekiest person you know, and you say, hey, I'm going to buy a new computer for my kid for Christmas, what do you think I should buy? The first question they always ask you is, well, what is he going to do with the computer? Or what is she going to do with it? What do they like to do? And so we want to make sure we know what we want to do in the learning phase, and that's going to help us understand what kind of devices we need and what kind of content we need to support that as well. So the first question I was going to ask ourselves here is really thinking about, do we have content adoption processes that really work in a digital age? And I think a lot of states and a lot of districts have been going through a process over the last numbers of years where there's been a lot of kind of willy-nilly, fly by the seat of the pants processes going on, and they often tend to be in conflict with the more traditional processes that we've had in schools for so many years. Particularly in states that have more formal adoption processes with state adoption lists at the state level, where textbook publishers have had their content vetted to ensure that it was accurate and all that, and met state standards, all those different things that were of concern, right? And then you had an adoption process at the local level to kind of look at those materials, decide which ones you thought were going to work best for you, and you ordered your textbooks and your content and supplemental materials and so on and so forth. And so there was a large, long vetting process to really try and ensure quality. But in today's world, what we're starting to see is that both budgets have been a problem over the last decade or so, and so that kind of normal 5-year, 6-year, maybe textbook adoption cycle has been disrupted completely, and some people are still waiting for books. I know I taught at one school for 7 years, and in that 7 years, I never saw new books. I had the same books that the teacher before me had in that classroom, and I'm not sure how many years they had those books. And then when I left, those books were still there, and never saw new textbooks in that time. And so the only new content that came into my classroom were things that me as an individual teacher just went and found online. And this was, of course, in the kind of middle to late 90s, so there was less out there, and I was kind of mostly just making stuff up. And so we see budgets are impacting our adoption cycles, as well as the atomization of content. And so more and more content now, both from the traditional publishers, as well as increasingly with the open educational resources movement, we're starting to see more and more content coming in smaller packages, smaller bite sizes. So in the same way that iTunes kind of disrupted the music market and said, you don't have to buy the whole album, you can buy just the song. We're seeing more and more, you don't have to buy the whole book, you can just buy the chapter, or maybe just the lesson. Or just the widget that's in the lesson. And if it's an open educational resource, you're not even buying it, you're just simply deciding to use it. And again, what then comes into play there, and how do we consider the quality question, and how do we use these things together and try and ensure some sort of a viable, cohesive curriculum? And so this has become an increasingly challenging space for folks, and I think for the classroom teachers, what's also becoming increasingly challenging is how you then deal with the management of having all these disparate pieces of curricula that you found on the internet and other places that you, as a professional, know these are high quality, perhaps, but how do you then manage them in such a way that it makes it easy for you to use them as an instructional tool and for your kids to use them as a learning tool? So what I wanted to do is kind of go through a little bit of a look at how some of this has worked over the years and how we might consider some changes to that. And this is something you might even do just as an individual teacher. We might hopefully see larger groups of folks do this. So we have on the screen here is what I would think of as a somewhat simplified, but generally speaking, relatively accurate version of what the textbook adoption process used to look like, right? When your turn finally came up after 12 years and the budget came through and you were told, hey, you get new algebra books this year. I said, great. And so you ordered sample copies and you went out and you called Houghton Mifflin and McGraw-Hill and Pearson and all the various companies, said, hey, can you send me a copy of your algebra text to teach? I want a teacher copy. I need to see the student's book. If there's supplemental materials, I want to see those as well. And you get this stuff in the mail and you'd review those samples. You identify what you liked and what you didn't like, the pros and cons of each. And if you're an adoption state, then you were, only asking for those ones from adopted lists. If you're in a non-adoption state, you're just calling those companies that you know. And in the end, you end up choosing the least objectionable version. I think it's pretty rare that we ever found one in that process where you said, wow, soup to nuts, page 1 to page 400, I love this thing. Everything they do is fantastic. Usually it doesn't happen, but you find one that you say, this is good enough. There's a couple things here I would change, but I can work with this, right? And so you choose the least objectionable. And then over time, you replace parts. So those parts that you identified right from the get-go, I wasn't real happy how they dealt with, say, the linear equations. So you said, all right, that's okay, because my old textbook, actually, I really loved the way that did it, so I'll just pull those off the shelf when I need it. Or if I found this stuff on the internet, it's much better, I'm going to use that instead, right? And so over time, you replace parts, and eventually, someday, hopefully before too long, you get to order sample copies again, another 6, 8, 10, 12, 15, 20 years later when your budgets come through, and rinse and repeat, and you go through that process. That's the kind of traditional model. I know it's somewhat simplified. Obviously, there's other larger curricular goals in mind that you have and whatnot. But in general, once you've gotten to the point where you've recognized what it was that you wanted in general, you went out and you found those samples. In today's world, in a slightly digital version, the kind of baby step forward might be that not much has changed, with the exception of, if I start to use some digital materials in there, not only can I replace things, but I can also augment them in a sense that, it's just kind of add on, and I find not only just replacing things wholesale, but I can just start kind of pulling in little pieces that I might find on the internet somewhere to go along for the ride with what's already in that printed materials. But pretty much the same kind of thing. We could step that up a little bit more, and we can really start to think about, people are starting to find systems that allow them to, like many publishers now are offering online environments for their books. And in them, very often, they'll say, we used to have maybe 2 or 3 or 4 different series of the algebra book. If you buy a subscription to our service, we'll actually give you access to all 4 of them, right? And you can kind of mix and match, figure out what you like, and over time, what you can start to do is kind of mix and match within that environment and kind of figure out what you want to do. And many of these systems also allow you to introduce your own content, so maybe you can pull in some OERs there and kind of modify and remix some of those things that are of the OERs, and you essentially add them to a playlist. And you say, okay, this is now my algebra curriculum. I've swapped out that chapter I didn't like from that particular series, but I've pulled in something else that I did like. I've made some changes to it. Maybe it's for all the kids, maybe it's just for some of the kids, right? And then ultimately, we may reach a stage where, whether that environment that you're using is provided by a traditional publisher, or in the kind of normal professional education world that we've seen, or some of the new emerging partners that are starting to put out products that primarily driven by the OER space, that allow us to now say, you know what, I'm not even going to start with that choose the sample, because I've been at this long enough that I essentially have my base playlist, and now I'm just, my process starts to transition into a more traditional or a non-traditional kind of constancy of search and discovery, right? And so this 8-year cycle, where in these versions back here, we were kind of doing things in these herky-jerky, every 6 years we would make some fundamental big shift, and then we would kind of hurry and try and replace some pieces and maybe add a couple things here and there. We might move ourselves into something that says, continuously, we can just keep doing this all the time. And I can have an environment that allows me to continue to change these things over time. It might be something you're doing all by yourself, although it's a lot of work. In a larger district, it could be the kind of thing that across a district, all the algebra teachers together are working together to consistently and constantly review this materials. And maybe you decide, let's make sure nothing in this collection on our playlist lasts more than about 3 years without having been reviewed and looked at and recertified by us as a district. You pick your own time frame, but now it allows you to just continue to search and discover those pieces that are out there. Again, they could be commercial products, they may be OER products, and when you find the ones that you like, remix them, modify them as necessary. Or if you really can't find something that you really like as a district, maybe you decide, let's just write the stuff that we know is good, right? We can maybe use some of the things that were there before, but ultimately author some new pieces, add those to my playlist, and then that then changes the process, where instead of being once every 6 or 8 years, it becomes a constancy. That constancy, of course, if you think about it from an administrative perspective, is a great thing, because that constancy really is embedded PD. Anytime you get a bunch of teachers together to talk about curriculum, they're going to start talking about how they use it. And then just in that conversation, they're now talking pedagogy, they're talking content, technology is going to get pulled in there. You're talking about all three pieces all together. How do these complement each other? And it's exactly the kind of conversations I think that keeps us all in education, because that's what's so dynamic about the space. So I wanted to kind of real quick just point out a couple that I'm aware of, and I'm sure there's more, and maybe in the chat, if you've got other examples, you may want to toss them in there and share them with the group. But here's some of the playlisting tools that I know exist out there in the OER world that have seen some pretty good success. You know, this one here is from Hippocampus, and you'll find it at hippocampus.org, and they've got a tool in here you can even see here on this screenshot. You know, it says teachers only, sign up, create a free account, customize Hippocampus for your students, make playlists with content, right? So this is one of those places they've got a lot of content in there now, powered by, you know, the NROC project. And then you can pull in content from other places and make your own virtual textbooks, right, that you can then use with kids. So this is a great site. There's another one here, CK12. I think many of us know about this one. This was, you know, created out in California originally. They've got the Flex books, so they're all, again, just like Hippocampus, they're all already pre-vetted and pre-created books. But then with the Flexbook technology, you can then modify those, swap pieces in and out, put stuff in that you wrote yourself or wherever it might have come from. And again, another similar style of tool, does the same kind of thing, allows you to do that playlisting and try and come up with the content that works for you. And then another one here, NetText. This is another new one that I've seen recently. And you know, this one is, the nice thing I like about NetText is they've got, again, pre-organized groups of resources. But then on top of this, the other nice thing is that they have an app that runs on iOS. They got Android, it runs on the web. So if you have, say, a tablet device, you can actually pull down their app and use the content within an app. So it's not necessarily running through a browser. It's a little bit easier for them to create kind of a richer environment in which to house that content on a tablet that way, right? And then you can pull it offline and so on. So you're not necessarily always having to be online with that. So those are just three kind of examples of some of those technologies that exist out there. And I'm sure there's many more of them out there. I just wanted to point out a couple. And then I also wanted to talk a little bit about how we find the apps, because increasingly what we're finding is that it isn't just the content, but it's the apps that do things. Because as we've always known, the promise of technology in the classroom was not just simply a window to the world. It was the computing power that we had on in that technology, and the ability to not just simply look at content, but interact with the content, play with the content, you know, and be able to, you know, have something that was fully interactive, whether it was adaptive to the student or whether it was simply because some things are easier to do when you see them visually, you know, whatever it might be. And of course, in this new world, we've got hundreds of thousands of apps out there, lots of people writing them, some of which are coming from the professional industry that we can know and recognize that, oh, that's coming from you know, company X, I know who they are, I trust them. But then others coming from places you have no idea who they are. And so it's become increasingly difficult for teachers to try and figure out, well, what do I do with all that, right? How am I supposed to know what's good? And I know districts are struggling sometimes saying, what am I supposed to do? I mean, do I just give every teacher some money on the App Store, what, you know, be a Google Play or iOS store or whatever, and just let them buy things? Or, you know, how am I supposed to be vetting all this stuff? And so this is our shameless plug from Common Sense Education. We have a product out there called graphite.org. And again, as a reminder, we're a nonprofit. And so what you'll find on Graphite are reviews of apps and content, right? And so these reviews are on there from two different sources. One of them are teacher reviews. So any teacher, so if you're a teacher, we'd love to have you come on, create an account, sign up, and leave reviews against apps and other things that you yourself have used. You know, tell us what you thought of it and what you did with it, because teachers like to know, what are other teachers doing with this stuff? And then there's also reviews from our professional editorial group that looks at these with a very rigorous rubric to really try and tease out, you know, is this pedagogically sound? Is the content accurate? Is it easy to use? We're in the midst now of a project that by the beginning of calendar year 2016, we hope to have about 1,000 of the apps that are kind of the most popular ones rated and reviewed against a security standard, right? Because increasingly we want to know, what are these companies doing with the data? Because some of these apps have a lot of data in it that's you know, personal to the student. And so if you've got real assessment data in there or anything like that, you know, what are they doing with that data? Is it being held privately? Is it on a secure server? Are they, you know, using it to profile my kids? Are they doing good things, or are they not doing good things? You know, most of these companies I think are doing good things, but some of them, again, are coming from companies that are not education companies. They may not understand the space, and they may not realize that some of the things they're doing in order to try and maybe keep the app price low by then doing other things with the data, say in a marketing way, really is a no-no in education, but they may not realize that. So trying to both set a standard so people kind of pay attention, this is what I should be doing with my data, as well as just trying to give information back to teachers and to districts about who the good actors are and who's really doing a good job to protect that student data. And so you'll find here on graphite.org all kinds of apps in the reviews. We have, you can view this stuff, you can search through it, you can browse through it by subject areas. We've got just, opened up, I think in the last 24 hours or so, new pages kind of, so you can see kind of top math apps, top social studies, so on and so forth. If you want to kind of surf through it via standards, we have a Common Core Explorer. So for those of you in states who have adopted those standards, whether you've named them something else or whatever, but if you need to view these things by standards, and then the other interesting thing that we've added is our lesson flows. And so we want to take a look at lesson flows. So lesson flows are basically digital lesson plans. So it's not simply what are the ratings of these apps, are they any good? Is it a 5-star app or a 2-star app? But what are people doing with it and how do we use them? And one of the challenges we found was that apps are granular, they're pretty small, and oftentimes alone don't constitute a lesson, so to speak. You can't just use that one thing and get the job done. You need a multitude of apps sometimes to get things done. And so since we've got a group of folks who've gone through and looked at so many different apps, it was easier for us to start to pull those together into essentially a digital lesson plan. So here's a screenshot of one by one of our Graphite certified educators. So our Graphite certified educator is one who's gone through a process to make sure they're trained up and so on and so forth. And you can read more about that on our website. About how to become a Graphite certified educator. But in the meantime, this is one of our educators here, Emily S. from Alabama, and she's got a lesson here on the solar system and beyond. And what I wanted to point out was on the right, you can see the steps. There's those 7 steps, the pre-planning, hook, direct instruction, so on and so forth. This is the basic model that we've kind of decided to use because we needed to have some sort of a structure, right, in those lesson plans. And as we look at this, for example, here's just the screenshot of the section on the pre-planning. You can see there's a couple different pieces in here, different apps. There's ThinkLink and Newsela and Common Curriculum, right? And again, these ones happen to be free. Many of the apps in Graphite are commercial apps. And you can see, but the nice thing is here's the suggestions on these 3 different apps and how they might get used in the pre-planning phase. And then here, I didn't take the whole screenshot of the whole screen, but you can see in each of these different phases, the multitude of different apps that are being suggested to be used. So in the guided practice section, for example, the lesson doesn't necessarily ask you to use all 6 of those apps. But there are a couple in there where it's, you could use this one or that one, depending on what you want or depending on the student. Some kids may do better with one than another. But this is a way to try and help you, again, as a teacher, navigate your way through this so that you can kind of see how these all piece together and ultimately lead into an interim assessment and then a final summative project. So you can see in this one, some suggestions, and again, you can kind of see the edge of the writing there where there are suggestions, the students could make a movie, they might make a book, they might use the Educreations Interactive Whiteboard to draw something, right? So different ways of kind of piecing these together. But again, being able to provide some digital lessons for folks to be able to see how all these apps come together. So Graphite is a site that is both helping you find high quality apps and then helping you be able to use them better. And so in this system, we've also got a blog that talks about ed tech, and we've got links to our webinars, links to video assets and other pieces to help you out. So we encourage you to check that out as well. And in these last couple minutes, I don't want to go too deep into these, but I did want to kind of point out there are other processes, just like when we were talking earlier about kind of how is it that we look at content adoption. Some other processes that you may want to consider looking at in your districts, particularly as digital comes in. These are 2 places where oftentimes technology has started to kind of disrupt how we usually do things, and we may need to take a look at it to make sure that these processes are actually supporting the ultimate goals that we wanted to get done, right? So when it comes to like buying computers, or if you want to just call them devices, tablet, laptop, whatever you might call the thing, the processes that we used to use, where oftentimes this was something that the IT department did, isn't always useful anymore, right? Because when it was the IT department, it was usually because they were buying a computer lab and it was static, it wasn't moving, and it's a pretty easy defined set of this is why we have this lab. And today, when we're buying devices nowadays, often it's for carts or more so, the ongoing trend of one-to-one and one-to-world projects where you've got every student with a device. And so now kind of the paradigm has shifted there. And so, who has input into these processes, who's making those decisions, doesn't necessarily mean that all the teachers are supposed to be in charge of that decision. But if you don't have input as a teacher, then I'm not sure how the administration and the IT department is making the decision without input from their faculty, right? So you really want to look at those processes, and also then, how are practices and ideas being shared across your district? Is it haphazard or is it really systemic? If you're in a large district and maybe you got 15, 20 elementary schools, we like on one hand to try and balance this idea that we want to give teachers freedom to innovate because we're trying to find those next best practices. But when you find one, how is it that we're scaling that across our district? If we have a strategy that truly works for a particular learning outcome, why wouldn't we want all of our teachers to know about it and be able to use that? And how are you doing that? So some other processes to think about as you get into that work. Finally, just wanted to point out real quick here, at Common Sense, we are hosting a series of webinars based around what we're calling the essential elements for digital learning. You can see them all here laid out in all these different gears. You can learn a little bit more about it at commonsense.org/educators. Look under the professional development section. But you'll find here that we're doing a monthly webinar series. The next one happens to be tomorrow. And so tomorrow is maybe not as much interest to teachers, but maybe to your IT directors, business officers, superintendents, and others. The art of procurement, balancing price versus performance. So we'll be talking a lot about how you actually buy this stuff, because increasingly budgets are tight. And if you do it right, you can get good pricing as well as getting high quality services and equipment that you need for your schools without necessarily having to get more money than you might already have. And then finally, we will be at ISTE, so you can find us at booth 1912. And if you've got questions, I know we're going to be running out of time pretty quick here, but you can always email me at jmao@commonsense.org, and you can kind of follow my attempts to be a Twitter person at jmao1to1. But I'm still a bit of a Twitter noob after having spent 10 years in state government where we tried not to touch social media so we wouldn't get ourselves into trouble too much. So anyway, that's my 30 minutes. I know that was fast and me talking quick. And again, thanks to Learning Revolution and all the work they put into pulling this together. We would love to get you to fill out a survey at the end here, learningrevolution.com/survey. Let us know what you thought so that we can try and continue to make this event a better event. And with that, check in. Let me look back on the screen here to see if anyone was chatting. Don't see anything coming up here. All right.
So I'm going to hop in on the mic. Thank you so much, Jeff, for everything today. A lot of great content in your presentation. Some people chiming in with thank yous as well. And Viva, to answer your question, the webinar is going to be archived on YouTube.
Okay.